Good afternoon. We're here today to discuss issues and concerns that have arisen again in light of the recent murder of George Floyd. Watching that video was heart-wrenching and devastating. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, calling out for his mother and repeatedly saying, "I can't breathe." Do you know how long 8 minutes and 46 seconds is? It's long enough that things could have been done differently. Things should have been done differently. George Floyd was suffocated by the knee of an officer and by the failings of a system that was supposed to protect him. This moment builds on the complex 401-year history of our nation. This moment also includes Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and so many others whose lives were cut short and whose loved ones grieved their loss. Their killings spurred international protests, and the likes of which we have never seen. And as we deal with this national crisis, we are still trying to create new norms as we face an ongoing global pandemic. We are in two different moments, both of which are exposing the underlying systemic racism that exists and creates disparities in every facet of our lives. Recently, I attended rallies and events and I've talked with residents, and they are tired from racism and the pandemic. They are concerned and scared. They are processing the magnitude of the issues that would allow an officer to feel so comfortable doing what he did in broad daylight while being filmed. Was it because of how many times this has happened before without justice served? I don't know. But I do know people are fed up and they want to know what can and what will be done about it. The protests have amplified the calls for justice across the world. And while we have worked hard to make sure this is a place where great things are happening, these calls require us to look internally here in Newport News and identify where we can improve. Now, I have been reflecting on my history here in our city to help process all that is happening. Many of you know that I was born and raised less than 2 miles from here, right where we're standing. As a child, I watched my dad come home from working hard in the shipyard every day. Stuck under supervisors he outperformed because promotions weren't offered to him. The others called him boy, even though he was a grown man. It was so sad that he had to endure such treatment in order to provide for his family. As I grew up, I endured my own experiences with race-based hate as well. When I was 8, I was walking down the sidewalk when someone hit me with a bottle. And I just had abdominal surgery, and the bottle was full and hit me in the stomach. To this day, I remember the physical and emotional pain of being hit. I flinched for the next few months every time I passed by someone who was white, fearing that they may have a bottle also. Fear caused my parents to have talks with me and my siblings on how to act when we went to stores. To protect us, they said if a white customer came up behind us, we should let them go ahead of us and say, "No, sir," and "Yes, sir," so we wouldn't be in any trouble. In 1972, I worked as a long-term substitute teacher in Newport News. It was the first year of forced integration, and it was fascinating to watch the change in student behavior. At first, the students segregated in the classroom based on what their parents had taught them about their differences. Later, they interacted with each other on a personal level, learning their similarities for themselves. This illustrated to me that we weren't born with hate, not with hate in our hearts. It was taught. When I was 28, my wife, Valerie, and I decided to move back to Newport News, and I graduated from dental school. I moved into a neighborhood in the central part of the city, and we were the first black family to move there. When she was pregnant with my daughter and my son was a toddler, someone threw a rock through the picture window, and we replaced it. Then a chunk of concrete came crashing through, and we replaced the window again. Then there was a gunshot. We replaced the window a third time and moved to another neighborhood. I was terrified and furious that this could happen to us when all we were trying to do was live a normal life and provide a safe environment for our children. Now fast forward 43 years, and now I'm terrified for how this world will treat my 5-year-old grandson, like so many other grandparents around the country. And now instead of the conversations like my parents had with me, many black parents today have the talk with their kids on how to interact with law enforcement so they can come back home safely. Now, I'm not telling you this story to make this moment about me. I'm telling you my story because it is like the stories of thousands of black residents who call Newport News home. We can remember how these events made us feel and the unfairness of having to endure them. These experiences are not in the distant past and cannot be forgotten. These stories must be heard and reckoned with. And I'm sure some will respond, well, these were just terrible people who did these things. They were just bad apples. But experiences like these are too widespread for us to focus solely on individual behavior. We have to dig deeper into the root of the issue and fix the systems that teach and feed this type of hate. Now, I ran for mayor because I love my city and I knew I wanted to help make this a better place. And part of that is working to keep our youth protected so they can grow up and help us change all the mess our previous generations created. Most major change in this country has happened at the hands and hard work of youth movements, like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee during the Civil Rights era. If we do our job to protect and nurture them, the youth will lead us. I'm not alone in my goals. As the current president of the African American Mayors Association, I am constantly speaking with mayors from across the nation. We all want our cities to be the best they can be, and for our young people to be safe and healthy as they grow into great leaders. We are seeing what has worked well in other cities and discussing changes that help fix broken systems. This worldwide discussion is taking place because of the killing of George Floyd and the international outrage it created. In honor of Mr. Floyd's life and in my role as president of the AAMA, I ask all mayors to fly their city flags at half-mast today. We are encouraged by the wide-scale demonstrations taking place throughout the country to demand an end of police violence. But we must continue this momentum by looking at long-lasting policy changes. The message from America and the world is clear. Inaction is unacceptable. There are national proposals being discussed and actions taking place in other cities, but not everything translates to Newport News. We are actually leaders in the public safety field, garnering national recognitions and awards for our work. Newport News has already implemented some of the national demands, but there are changes that still need to be made. And while I do not support disbanding the police, I do support working together with our city council in partnership with our city manager, Chief Drew, Sheriff Morgan, Commonwealth's Attorney Gwynn, state and federal legislators, other public officials, and most importantly, residents of our great city. We must find solutions to achieve public safety in the truest sense of the words, and equally for all. And while we are looking at specific policy changes, I know we can make changes in funding decisions. We have to work to ensure that every single tax dollar we spend is used to best protect and invest in our community. When we think about public safety, we can use the peer model: prevention, intervention, enforcement, and reentry. And we need to make sure that resources are being invested in each category in an equitable manner, not just in enforcement. Additionally, it is extremely important that every single household in Newport News is counted in the census. Crucial federal funding comes to our city based on the census data. These federal dollars can help better fund the initiatives we need to invest in our communities. We also need to look at the proposals for closing gaps and disparities in economic stability, education, health care, food access, and more. Census-based federal funding can help with these. Now, we have a lot of work to do, but we cannot miss this moment. As we work to create a more just society for some, we are making it more just society for all our residents, from City Hall to Lee Hall. Right now, as millions across the globe are making sure their voices are heard, we have to seize this moment and go from protests to policy changes. In Newport News, we have the right mix of energy, determination, passion, and opportunity. And I'm here today to share that we've heard your cries for reform. We've listened, and we continue to make transformative changes. This doesn't happen overnight. As a matter of fact, several years ago, Newport News City Council and City Administration identified the need to make community policing a priority. We looked for a leader to work with us and the community to rebuild trust and inspire change. We've taken incredible steps, but there's still much work to be done. I support the men and women in the Newport News Police Department and the new initiatives that they have undertaken, many of which have already made a visible difference in our community. Chief Drew is here to address some of the concerns we have heard from citizens and share some of the changes the department has implemented. Chief Drew.
I too want to join the mayor in this conversation today and address some of the frequent questions that have been proposed by multiple individuals through either email or just verbal conversation about some of the conversation that we're seeing after the tragic death of Mr. Floyd, whose funeral was today. So my hope is to look at some that have overlapped and try to address some of those questions directly. And then I'll share with some things that we have already started and have been doing in the Newport News Police Department, some changes that are in the process of and changes that will be. So at first, before I address that, President Obama, his administration, a friend of mine, Chief Ramsey at the time, oversaw the 21st century policing. It was a recommendation of how to move policing into the 21st century and things that we should focus on. And I want to read out those 6 pillars, and then I'll go in directly into the questions that we're focusing on and that our citizens are asking. The first, to build a better police department in the 21st century, is building trust and legitimacy. The second is policy and oversight. The third is technology and social media. The fourth is community policing and crime reduction. The fifth is training and education. And the sixth is officer wellness, taking care of our officers. So some of the questions that we've seen citizens ask and concern about, I want to try to address very directly. De-escalation is something that we have practiced and trained in our academy. Not only do we have classes for de-escalation, but we also insert it in our use of force training, in our scenario training. We take things that we learn in the classroom, and when we apply them, we use them in multiple facets of our training. training scenarios. For example, someone will respond to a scene. In a training scenario, they might have to use force, de-escalation. The scenario would change. We build on each thing that we learn. Chokeholds. It is clearly spelled out in our use of force policy. Clearly. This police department does not use any form of chokeholds and any kind of restraint around the neck. It is the most tender part of the body, and we stay away from that. There was a good question, a very direct question about duty to intervene. And I will share with you, as I heard the national conversation, in our policy we talk about, and it's laid out, that we have the duty to inform, meaning that if the chief or any other officer did something wrong, either verbally or physically, there's a duty for officers to inform that their supervisor. What I did not have was verbiage that said direct duty to intervene. So I listened to the conversation that was going on in nationally, the conversation I've had with the mayor and the city manager almost daily, to talking about how do we continue to move our organization forward. So we now have on Saturday, just this past Saturday, we inserted that into our use of force policy in black and white, written, a duty to intervene. So if something were to happen, either verbally or physically, that it is an officer's responsibility that's there to intervene, regardless of rank. So even if I got into an argument with someone and tempers escalated, it doesn't matter to me if it's a sergeant or lieutenant, an officer or a recruit, that I would expect them to intervene. Now some may say that's hard because I may have more experience or a rank. It's on the leadership of this department to encourage the culture that allows that, supports it, pushes it. We have got to be, the mayor says it all the time, we have got to be accountable for our actions. And I want to create a culture in this police department, your police department, that puts accountability on every single officer, every single individual, regardless of their position, where they work, their title. I'm going to do my best to hit most of the questions that have come through. If any that I miss, I apologize on the front end. Officers cannot fire at moving vehicles unless their life is in immediate danger or the life of someone else. They're expected to try to get out of the way, but if the situation arrives where they can't, they have the right to defend themselves or another individual. But they must also be cognizant of other individuals in that vehicle. So it's not something that is routine and can only happen if their life is in immediate danger. The use of force continuum is something that's been debated in law enforcement for years. It goes back and forth. Our use of force policy spells out very clearly that we only use the amount of force necessary to meet the amount of resistance or the amount of force needed to get a situation under control. For example, if someone is yelling at you, our first response is not to produce a firearm and display our firearm. If we flip that, if someone points a firearm at an officer, we're not going to ask them to put their gun down. We're not going to deploy OC spray or use our ASP or a taser. We match the force that we're presented with. And we have to be careful when we talk about the use of force continuum. We have a lot of options. But if an officer's life is in immediate danger, they're going to use the force to match the force that's presented against them. My friend Sheriff Morgan, I think he addressed it very, very clearly in a panel discussion we had the other day. The best thing we can do is training, training, training. Continuing to develop training outside of our own department, right? That we bring citizens in from the outside, experts that talk about domestic violence, experts that talk about mental health and autism. Instead of someone in uniform reading it from a PowerPoint, individuals who work with individuals who have autism, their family members may have autism, individuals who are experts in mental health, how to address that, de-escalation. Some call it, there was a citizen asked me about verbal judo. What that is how we talk to people. The best asset we have, the best weapon utility that we have is our presence and the way we talk to people. We can de-escalate so much. The department focuses on de-escalation training. We focus on verbal communication, reducing situations, stepping back, creating distance. All those things come into play. But the best asset we have is how we approach and how we talk to people. We have to hold each other accountable. If we see someone, hear something, we have to address that. We have a tracking system set up not only for officers, for any complaint that's made, whether it's founded or unfounded, It goes into a personnel file, an electronic document. And we keep track of that officer from the day they're hired until they retire. The chief of police as well. That helps us if an individual gets multiple use of force incidents or multiple complaints, when we have those one-on-one interviews or when those complaints come in, that we can address that. So even if an officer has multiple use of force and they're all in policy, it still allows us, creates us an opportunity to have the venue to sit down and have a discussion with that officer. We also track it, as I can look at it for a department. Are our complaints going up or are our complaints going down? Are our use of forces going up or are the use of forces going down? We publish that yearly in our annual report. The last 2 years, in 2018 and 2019 both, we've published that. That's important for me to see that as an agency. We have outside entities come in and do accountability checks on our department. CALEA is an organization that only less than 1%, 22 departments in the country are CALEA certified in what we call the TRIARC Award. That's 3 categories. The first and foremost is our individual policies. Are they the best national standard? The second is our training academy. How are we training officers? How are we training our individuals that come into this organization? And the third is our communications or 911 center. We passed all 3. Most departments will do that one at a time. We did all 3 at the same time. We have to continue to look and reinvest in what is going on in the best practices. How do we get better? We can't say that what we've done, we've achieved it, and we've reached that point. We have to continue to go to the next step. One of the situations that I've seen where we fall short is a supervision to officer ratio. Now that is something that we've been working on and was just approved. I want to thank the city manager for helping me get that finished. But I will now have a sergeant for every 6 officers. The quicker a sergeant interacts in a situation, use of force goes down, complaints go down. The more an officer is responsible for 6 officers instead of 8, 10, or 12, they have a more intimate knowledge of who that officer is. What is the best training? What are things that they need to move to the next level? What are some deficiencies that we need to focus on? Those are all pluses. Those are things that we look at other departments. We look at NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Officers, and IACP, the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Those look at departments across the country and what works, what doesn't. How do we mold that to fit Newport News for our citizens to make this the best department on the East Coast, if not across the country? That's my commitment. We can never rest and say we're there. So we look at some of the other questions that have come through, just to hit a few. One of the questions we talked about: do officers threaten citizens with use of force? We don't teach that. We don't teach that if you don't comply, this is what's going to happen. We don't teach that. Again, the use of force that we use should match the amount of restraint that's presented against us. The last 2 that I want to touch base on are use of force reports mandatory, and they are. Anytime an officer uses any type of force that's other than standard handcuffing techniques. Mr. Drew, you're under arrest, put your hands behind your back, and I do, that's an arrest. Anything else, any type of resistance, a struggle, a fight, whatever it might be, a pursuit, we do a use of force report. That report goes through the chain of command and ends up on the use of force review board where they review it, where citizens are a part of. And that's important. Citizens see it. Every officer in Newport News has a body-worn camera. We have citizens on a use of force review board with an officer, a sergeant, a lieutenant, and a captain to watch that incident unedited. Unless it's excessive force, which is criminal, or could be, or a police-involved shooting. That is presented to our Commonwealth Attorney, our state lab process in Norfolk, and our Internal Affairs Division. And any time a police officer involves deadly force, the first stage is to investigate it as a criminal matter, just like anyone else. If anyone in this uniform or myself commit a crime, we should be treated just like anyone else. There's no separation there. That comes back to accountability. But we do calculate, anytime you use force, it is written photographs. Then there was a question about medical attention. Once we make an arrest, anytime anyone is in our custody, we become responsible for that individual. Whether they need medical attention, whether they ask for it or not. So if someone is injured during an arrest that takes place and they don't want medical attention, we're still required to get it and maintain that paperwork. If there is no sign of injury and they complain of their shoulder, or maybe they had a pre-existing injury, their knee, we're required to get them medical attention. Not only physical, but also mental. All of those things are captured. We keep that in a database so we can look at where we're at, and we publish all that information yearly So the mayor, we talked a little bit about things we've already done. Because I don't want to start trying to make this department better or focusing on issues just because of what we saw in Minneapolis. The death of Mr. Floyd was tragic. It's horrific. It sent ripples across this country. It affects every department. It happened a city and states away, but we don't want it to happen here. Now, I'm asked one of the questions, can I guarantee it'll never happen in Newport News? I can't. I don't know any chief that can. All I can do is try to put things in strategy and training and set the culture of this department. That we prevent or decrease, I guess that's the best way to say it, decrease the probability or the possibility, remove elements that would contribute to that happening. Where we focus on training, bringing the best officers into this organization, making sure that we do good, strong background. I will tell you, we looked at an individual just the other day. We looked at some social media posts, and I get the individual's young. But because of some of the things that are on social media, that is not a good fit for this organization. And we withdrew our offer. But we had a conversation. We also have a recruit class that we want to go in and talk to. I want them to know the community they're getting ready to serve. That's why we take that recruit class out of the academy for a week. We put the books away, and we go into the community and work with pastors, leaders in our community, homeless, individuals that suffer from drug addiction, people that are challenged, and we work with the Boys and Girls Club. It's important for officers to get and interact with the community they serve. I understand the frustrations that individuals feel. I was mad. I was mad because what happened in Minneapolis, Mr. Floyd's death, sets us backwards. It sets us backwards of what we're trying to move forward to, right? Trust and legitimacy. That's why we're seeing some of the successes we are in this community. It's important. We focus on our youth. That's probably the biggest passion that I have. I want officers in this organization to care about the citizens they serve, regardless of where they live or their skin color or their race. Diversity matters, not just in our academies, but who we promote in our leadership team. Differences of opinions, different people that look at things differently and think about how to solve problems differently, bringing the right people to the table. In closing, my commitment is to do the best possible job I can to make this the best agency. When we interact with citizens, as a city manager, and I talked earlier today, how people feel during that interaction, that matters. How citizens feel when they interact with this department matters. Now, we may not always agree, but I expect our officers to treat people with respect, with dignity, with understanding and empathy of situations that people find themselves in. I continue to push, bring in the best officers that I can, promote diversity, talented people in this organization. I want to listen. I want to understand concerns that residents have. What are their issues? Some things and ideas that they might have. I don't think we can ever sit back and just say that we have it done. I apologize to the Floyd family and every resident in Newport News that has ever had a negative interaction with someone wearing this uniform. It's not my intent. Our Citizens Academy are brought up for those very reasons, to explain why we do things that we do, to have a better understanding, and I encourage anyone can apply, anyone can join the Citizens Academy, Youth Academy, or Young Adult Police Commissioners. All those are things that we're focusing on to make things better. Last thing I'll say, and I'm going to get out of the way, I sat with some protesters, demonstrators I would say more. They opened up in prayer at Tech Center. They've been there multiple days in the hot sun. And I went out and talked to them, and they asked, well, Chief, why don't you have body-worn cameras? Why don't you have citizens on panels? Why is there no use of force training? Why don't you de-escalate? Why would you do that? So as I touched base on some of the things I've touched on today, it was clear to me that they didn't know those things. And I've got to find a better way of exposing this department and talking about the things that we have and learning about things that we can do better. I'm going to step out of the way and turn it back over to the mayor. Sorry I took too long, but I appreciate the citizens of this community. I appreciate those that have called in with issues, concerns, and worries, and those that have called in with thank yous. I appreciate it. Thank you.
So, thank you, Chief Drew. We will continue to blaze this trail and grow the initiatives that we have identified to make Newport News a better place for all people. So at this point, Chief Drew and I are available for questions if the press has any.
Chief Drew, you touched on this just a little bit, but one of the things we've heard a lot from, I know specifically the Black Lives Matter group, is that the officers that were disciplined, maybe fired from an agency out of state and coming here to get a job. How do you background check that? I know specifically this organization, there was last year there was some controversy from an officer that came from the department on the south side and is now under this department. And how are you working?
So the two things: one, in our organization, if someone were to leave, we open up our books and allow that organization, their background investigators, to come in and look at it. We don't give them the file to take with them, but they can come in and look at it, and we have open conversations. And I expect our Internal Affairs Division, who has that file on each officer, to be open and transparent. And I will say that we've had that, an officer that wanted to go somewhere else, and once they looked at the file, this is someone we want. But it's also the same way. In our police department, we hire former officers who have retired from our agency to be our background investigators. So they have some investigative skills. They come up through the department, and they do in-depth searches and conversations through social media, psychological exam, whether they're coming from another agency or not. Most we require to do a ride-along once the COVID virus is over. But they also, then their packet is also in front of a panel where captains vote. And then they come in and have a one-on-one conversation with me. And I learned from Mayor Price when I came to Newport News, I didn't ask about their stats or type of arrest they made. I asked them about how do they feel about people. What's their commitment to youth? What do they want to see change? Why do they want to be in law enforcement? And why do they want to come to this city? I'm looking for individuals. It's not 1985. I'm looking for individuals who want to change things, be creative, think outside the box. When I started a while ago, we made a report, we may or not make an arrest, and we left. The smart officers got it. They invested in communities. We're trying to do more and more of that now. Citizens want to see that people invest in them and solve problems and work together and get them the right resources. So I think we have to do in-depth background, and I have no problem. If I were asked, do you support, if officers have discipline problems, to disclose that to other officers, other departments? Absolutely. I think citizens deserve that, and I think our profession deserves that.
Would you bring on an officer that may have discipline problems, hoping to work things out?
So I think you have to look, what is that discipline problem? Was it 5 years ago they had a car accident where their first year out that they said something they shouldn't have, and they've been in 9 years? I don't think you can put it in black and white. I think that's why you have to do an in-depth study and really understand what's going on. I rely a lot on our background investigators, but my commitment is this: if there's an officer that has a track record of problems, I don't need that in this organization, and this city doesn't need that. Again, my commitment is to bring the best officers on this department that want to be here, regardless of where they're from, but trying to understand who they are and what their history is. But that's what I'm looking for, is patterns. One incident, what is that incident? But I'm not looking to bring any problems into the agency. We're trying to weed that out and fix it on the front end. And I think we can fix a lot by the individuals we bring into this organization.
Those use of force histories, are those something that citizens can request or publicly available? Do you think that there needs to be more access to that kind of information?
So the use of forces that we have are, so unless it's criminal and into the criminal system, that is part of their personnel record. There's a lot of things when you talk about use of force. So if I use force, it may be justified or it may be not justified, right? Some questions came in about, well, excessive force. We don't teach excessive force. Excessive force is wrong. It may even be criminal and end up in Mr. Gwynn's office. So force or complaints, whatever the issues are, each one of those are investigated. And at the end of the day, I sign off on all that. Every citizen complaint that comes through, it lands on my desk, and a letter goes back out to that citizen. Your complaint was founded, where corrective actions are being put into place, and any type of discipline we do, any type of correct action, unless it's termination, I'm going to incorporate training. How do we get better? Training, right? Training. How do we get better? But some situations may not require training. Some may be immediate termination. I had a conversation with today that how we talk to people matters. And although force wasn't used, this is the second time that I've had to have this conversation. I'm not going to have it a third time. This department will take on officers will take on the auspice of their leader, the chief, the sergeants that they work for. At the end of the day, I'm accountable. And I have been very open with our city manager and the mayor, and I expect them, city council, I expect you to hold me accountable. I like the questions you ask. I don't run from that. And if I don't have the answer, I'll get it. And there are ideas out there that we haven't thought of. I had never thought of duty to inform until I saw it in another policy. And I heard about this national conversation, and it fits. It makes sense what we saw, and the mayor talked about what we saw that happened with Mr. Floyd when officers stood by, and whether they didn't feel that they could or they didn't know if they should, regardless. I need a culture in here that pushes that encourages that, rewards that, right? And it's also important to reward good behavior. But we have to move on it directly. And it's not something that we can just have a training class for 40 hours and we're done. It has to be something that's repetitive, right? Muscle memory. That's how you change a culture. It's not just going to a class in January and you've got it. It's the training gives you the foundation, but the culture has to enforce it. It has to reinforce it. How do we do that? Our quarterly interviews or quarterly check-ins that we have for our behavior checks, right? To make sure we're good supervision and officers. When I have a promotional process, it's important to me to have those type of questions. In the past, it may be just a question about policy. That's why I have citizens that take part in those promotional processes to ask questions different than I will ask. How do you feel about youth? How would you feel about if my son, how would you handle this situation? But questions about duty to intervene. If you saw this, what would you do? How would you respond to it? And sometimes those are uncomfortable. But I got to create an atmosphere that encourages that. And also an atmosphere that when we don't do it, that we address it quickly.
Any further questions?
Chief, you talk about it's an officer's responsibility to intervene in a situation no matter their rank or who they're up against. Is that a new policy or is that something on the party now?
So in our use of force policy, we had the language, right, in writing, in black and white. It said the duty to report. So if an officer saw me doing something, their responsibility is to let their sergeant know. And I get that. I did not have language about duty to intervene. I've heard the national conversation about some different organizations having that conversation, talking about it, and I found it in a policy in Baltimore about duty to intervene, and we looked at that, we made it fit for our department, and we just put it in the policy on Saturday, but we spelled it out. We spelled it out, and I never, in 27 years, I would have never thought you need to see that, right? But I think things we see, and that's why I talk about we can never just rest and we're done. We're always talking about what we can do better in law enforcement, learning from my partners, people who've been in it longer than me, people who are retired and having those conversations. But it is now in writing, in paragraph form, that officers do have the duty. They have the responsibility to intervene and report, not just sit back and tell somebody about it 2 or 3 days later. If a situation happens, even if I'm involved, I would expect Officer Price, Mayor Price, to intervene. I want recruits to feel, and I've got to be able to say that, right? It's incumbent upon me to push that out to our troops, that they know that, because that can be hard. But we've got to, everybody, right? Everybody in this organization, everybody who wears this uniform is accountable. We're all accountable to our citizens. And I just think that's a better way. That's something that we just added on Saturday and put in our policy.
Anyone else?
Mayor, I'll just ask real quick. You brought up that change doesn't happen overnight as the leader of this organization now. Is that an important message to get out? I've heard from some other longtime civil rights advocates. They say there seems to be a disconnect between, although things are right, compromise is still always part of the solution and things take time. You were discussing how you are not supportive of defunding the police. What is your message about how to move forward in a policy standpoint?
The message is what we've been doing, we want to continue. As the chief has stated, we are continuously reviewing our policies. We're continuously looking at other places that are doing things maybe differently and how they may affect and be agreeable with our city. So we will continue to reevaluate and look at policies and procedures. Culture change is the thing that takes time. Policies we can do effect, but you can't have culture change until people know that this is to expected of them. It has to be in black and white. This is expected of you. Then the culture changes because they know there are going to be consequences and accountability that he talked about. We have to have accountability for actions. Once people know that, the culture will dissipate and change. I want to thank you for coming out. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.